Good morning, and thank you for the introduction. Thank you so much for the invitation. I'm so glad that Dr. Bergman Gallegos said that we really don't know the future, because that really gives me a measure of, I can have a sigh of relief that I don't have all the answers here, but I can share some perspectives. And congratulations to you for having this first in-person meeting in quite a while. I'm glad to be a part of it. We've made it. We're enduring. We're adapting, and we're finding ways to continue to explore and advance, as we know that individuals are depending on us for this future. When we say they need to do something about it, we are they. So we must move forward, and I'm honored to be a part of this meeting. We have a lot of catching up to do and a lot to cover. So I'll just jump right in. And along the way, I'll tell you a little bit more about myself. You'll get a little bit more insight into my role as president at Westchester Community College. Last night at dinner, someone said, "How did Westchester from New York get to Witchy?" I said, they must have seen West in the title of the college and decided that I belonged here. But truly, we do recognize that community college is a part of a broader ecosystem. And I have had the honor of working with Dr. Bergman Gallegos and other experiences. So it's my pleasure to join you this morning. I'm going to, and our format will be that I'll talk to you for a little while, and I'd like to leave ample space for us to have Q&A, because I have some perspectives that I'd be happy to share. And you may have questions from what you're hearing based on the title, but the changing nature and change, I don't know which one of those of the optimal term there is, probably changing. And that's what we'll talk about a good amount. And there it is again, new strategies and models with the potential to address the crises of college completion, affordability, and employability, and close America's skills gap. That's the title that they gave me to work with. What a mouthful. What a big job that we have ahead of us. What a tremendous responsibility and opportunity. And as I think of the changing nature of higher education, some of you may be familiar with this, with these depictions. In the Chinese language, the word crisis is composed of two characters, one representing danger and the other opportunity. And clearly, as we look ahead at the community college landscape, we know that we've had a confluence of crises around us. But crisis can also mean opportunity. So I'm going to just pause here and tell you a story that I shared with my campus during convocation this year. It's a little different type of story. Normally at the beginning of the year, I come in talking about accomplishments, and I've got a neat PowerPoint showing our enrollment projections and our goals for the coming year. This year, I told them a story. I told them the story about how I tried kayaking this summer in the Long Island Sound, close to where I live. I signed up for the LL Bean Discovery course. And the first time I went was a beautiful 95-degree day, and I was the only student. So I had the instructor all to myself. So Gabe and I, it was wonderful. I saw the birds, it was beautiful. And so I decided to sign up again a few weeks later and invite a friend. Well, that day there were 10 people in the class, and I'm out there feeling, all, experienced. I think I had the most recent experience of the group. And wouldn't you know it, I was aggressively trying to turn that kayak, and it capsized. So there I was. In the Long Island Sound. Actually, we were in the bay, so it was a little calmer than the Sound. And I'm in the water. And so talk about words that we've learned during the past several years: uncertainty, unprecedented, uncharted territory. The one thing I knew that was for sure was that I couldn't stay there. I had to do something. So I had that duty to act for my own preservation. And it wasn't easy, because there was nothing I've ever done a day in the gym that prepared me to get myself back in a kayak from water. If you've ever experienced that and you've done it, wow, hats off to you. I wasn't trained for that, but I realized where I was. I had to just gain some perspective. And I remembered the quote from Arthur Ashe to start where you are, use what you have, and do what you can. And it's amazing the things when you're in a crisis, like what is your instinct? And my instinct to get out of the water, figure out, we were too far from the shore, but we saw some rocks and coordinated with the teachers. The rest of the class was sitting out there with their eyes, this big. And I was able to get to some rocks And it was really hard. I waded through seaweed. It was disgusting, but I did that. I knew I could not stay in that water. And so I was able to sit on a ledge and and I was saying, I don't know how I'm going to stand up from this seated position on the slippery rock. I'm like, I have a date tonight. I'm chilling wine and sushi. And my teacher says, Belinda, you are the sushi. So calm down. We've got to get you out of the water. Fortunately, I was able to climb up to higher ground and step into the kayak, and all was well. I lived to tell the story. My campus was incredulous that I told such a story, because they knew me for 7 years as a very professional, kind of a appropriate distant relationship as the president, and working with the various committees and teams and going through many things that we've been through together. But part of my telling that story was that this fall was our first major return to campus. And I knew how many of them felt. I knew the fears that they were experiencing. I knew the pain that they'd endured personally. And I knew that they wanted to be there for our students, and they were. And I wanted to let them know that we are in this together. We may not all be in the same boat, but we're in the same storm. And some people say, oh, I didn't have that much impact by the pandemic, but the world did. And many of our students and many of our colleagues certainly were impacted. So I wanted to let them know that I was similarly, well, but not because I fell out of a kayak. I experienced with them the loss of very close family members personally, and they had such an outpouring of love and concern toward me. I'm a COVID widow, and so I did lose my husband. I lost my mother, for whom I was guardian during the time. And so I wanted to let them know that I'm okay. I'm out there kayaking, had fun. I had a great date that night, went to see the Commodores. It was a lot of fun. And so resilience is the key thing, and that we can find a way when we look to see what we have and who's around us and who we can gather for support, and that we would continue to do that with each other on behalf of our students. So changing nature of higher education. This is just a tiny insight to what the headlines look like. We all see it. We all have our subscriptions to the Chronicle and Inside Higher Ed, and we get the information from Lumina. So we are looking at the same kinds of phenomena, as well as our own institutional data that tells us that, you know, things aren't the way they used to be. And the whole notion of back to normal is, you know, may not be optimal. It may be feel like a comfortable space. Back to normal for me in that kayak would have been to be on shore, but we saw some rocks. We're closer. We said, let's get the rocks, wedge the kayak in. You know, I could sit on this ledge. It was something completely different. There were risks involved and certain danger, because the rocks were slippery, the seaweed was gross, but, you know, I had to really power through it and find a new way. And so clearly, agility is something that's needed, the ability to think clearly and trust your instinct. If you read Malcolm Gladwell's Blink several years ago, you might want to dust that off again, to understand how do we trust our instincts, and how do we have that create the muscle memory, so that duty to act leads us to places that give us reasonable scenarios that we can create, important messages that we can give to our teams as the leader, so that we can keep them going through this turmoil. Again, a confluence of crisis and a density of very complex matters. And this barely scratches the surface. I don't have political strife up here, or racial reckoning, or social justice issues. There's so much more that is swirling around our institutions, so that as we revisit the purpose and value of our community college sector, we need to be very serious and understand the context in which we sit, what's happening within our society. I won't read through all of these. You probably have read some of these articles. What I will say, though, is that normal has been disrupted. And we know that there are things that we have to look for that are going to be different. What's new? What's next? But I challenge us also to think about, is normal really the desired state? And was normal working well for everyone? And certainly we have issues and questions about equity that our data reveal when we look at outcomes for students and we look at what's been happening in our institutions, the kinds of challenges that we faced, the fact that our EEO offices may be busier than we realize, and that our students' voices are revealing new insights that we may not have addressed as well as we might prefer to institutionally. So there are some opportunities ahead with these challenges. And we will be facing change, like it or not. So we used to say, oh, some people are averse to change. Well, we can't leave things to chance because that it could mean the end of several of our institutions. We have to act. This is a moment for us to rise in our leadership roles and to prepare our institutions and the individuals we serve for the future, and also to be responsive to those who are relying on the product that we yield, our students who we can present to them as not only educated, but whole in so many ways. And we have to pay attention to more than the skill set and the knowledge base, but also to the people who are in front of us. So I'll spend some time just talking a little bit more about this context, talk about change within our institutions, change as we look at who we're facing, and change as we're looking toward the future. So this is I love the art that you can get from just clicking on images. And so you put in like higher ed change and swirl. I got this great picture. And so she's got her umbrella, and so we're she's managing out there. And you may not be able to see, it says technology and technologies there. And I think that's repeated. Social change. Okay, there are a couple of things within that swirl. And it's an ever expanding swirl, this confluence of crises. And so one of the things that I feel a lot of pressure about now, and you're hearing the same thing, is about the employment gap. Employers are saying we don't have enough workers, and they need them today. They're trying on a daily basis to deal with this. And it's so important if our businesses are going to remain strong and we're going to remain competitive internationally, we have to be able to support this. This is sort of a big client of ours as community colleges, and we're known as the nimble sector of higher education. There's wages that have changed the dynamics of employment, and so many of our students are ones who are benefiting from these increased wages of jobs that aren't as high skilled. They're able to get $15, $20 an hour. And so for them, that's a very attractive alternative to coming to campus. And the public is questioning the worth of the credentials that we confer. There's vacant spaces as remote work has impacted our employers. And so everyone's looking for reinvention. At the same time, there's this very human dimension of what's happening on the worker side. I'll say that 33 million Americans quit their jobs since spring of 2021. That doesn't mean that they've all gone out to the woods to live in the wilderness and off the land. It means that they can move to other opportunities, because we had a fantastic hire in our procurement office. We were so excited because we had offered the position a couple of times. People used it to leverage it for another one. And we went through this hiring cycle and they'd leave. Well, this gentleman came and stayed for a month. And we introduced him around, we brought him to the board meetings, and he left for another opportunity that he said was his dream job. So there's not this loyalty just because we're doing mission-based work and people feel passionate about what we're doing. And so, so people will look for maybe an optimal position. They're using one job to leverage the next one. LinkedIn is reporting that they have 2 times more listings of openings than they had a year ago. For employees, there are significant mental health concerns amongst workers. I mentioned those that my colleagues were experienced. Nearly 1 million Americans died during this time of the pandemic. So imagine how many more are grieving, and they're coming to work with these anxieties and these concerns. Many are still caregivers, And this notion of quiet quitting, being on the job and not bringing 100% because they just don't have it, means that we may have to really look with empathy across the room, not only at the students, but at each other, while we're wanting so much innovation. Healthcare disparities are facing many childcare concerns, minimal or no social and support networks. So we need to think about these policies for remote working with a little more flexibility. And yes, those words came out of my mouth. Okay, so when my team is watching this video later, they'll say, yes, she did say it. And as leaders, we'll need to be prepared to speak truth to power where we can when it's time to look at what the reality is over the next 10 years. This is a tough time for institutions and for humans, and we want to help people to invest in the career choice that they've made and be available for our institutions and our students. There's change that's happening within us. We have to straddle this chasm between where we've been and where we're going. And ed tech is just part of it. I thought it was kind of a cute cartoon in some ways to show that we know that there are always some earlier adopters and others who are like, I'm not so sure, I'm not ready. Do we really need to change? And it's hard to imagine that there could be such conversations, but certainly we have to examine our whole institutional structures, and we have to look further north. Our North Star over recent years has certainly been the completion agenda and student success. And what do we need to do to organize ourselves better, to be student-ready colleges? And at the same time, we have the pressure of being future-ready colleges. And tech is definitely going to be a part of that as we understand the dynamics of artificial intelligence and the growth of algorithms and the fourth industrial revolution. We have to prepare for that in the midst of dealing with heartache and sorrow that's very real that folks are facing. So we have to have not only the North Star, but a further North Star, and get ourselves together to do the best we can with that. For me, it meant being a little vulnerable at convocation and saying, I don't have all the answers, but we're going to work on this together and bring our best selves to work every day to push this forward. So a couple of years ago, completion agenda was the big thing. And not that it's gone away, but our data was being analyzed to look at our access mission, but who was getting through. We were able to see that those numbers were not as robust as we would prefer or as good as we could do. And that we needed to give some attention to that. And then by disaggregating that data, we were able to see that there were some strengths and some areas that needed some definite attention. And so prior to that, it was access, fill the seats, let's get FTEs. That's what our budgets are built on. I mean, I've been in community college leadership long enough to understand that we were always concerned about academic quality and rigor. And yes, we wanted our students to have a good experience, but looking under the hood, we could see that we were losing many when we looked at year-to-year retention or semester-to-semester retention, and the whole DevEd quagmire was something that we recognized needed to be addressed, and that became a revolving door. We saw that when we looked at CESI and Community College Survey of Student Engagement, students who were so enthusiastic about starting their community college education who disappeared, who realized that they couldn't handle it, it wasn't for them, and perhaps we weren't the student-ready colleges that we needed to be. And so relief funds, how many of you have spent all of your HERF dollars? Oh, wow. Well, hats off to you, okay? Because I will tell you that has been a challenge, and we're close to it. But we've had to restructure and create new systems because we were not prepared for the infusion of those resources. And I'm so grateful for the government's investment in higher education in our nation. It's been a wonderful thing. We know that it's short term, but I bring it up here because part of the change within us is to move away from normal, to really think about what systems we can put in place and leverage this opportunity so that we're very different types of institutions, ones that can be nimble, we can flex from internal to external and blend what we've learned. We pivoted on a dime, community colleges and higher education in America, we had less than 5% of online education at my institution prior to the pandemic. And it was on our strategic plan. Let's see what percentage we can expand to. Well, guess what? In 2 weeks, we went to 100%. And we were able to extend our spring break. We were one of those lucky institutions, I suppose, that had that spring break right at that March 2020 time. And we added a week, and we got our faculty acclimated to what it meant to to switch their course to an online modality. And the overwhelming majority of that transition was synchronous learning. So prior to the pandemic, with a few asynchronous courses. And by the summer of 2020, we had 100% of our full-time and adjunct faculty trained in quality teaching modalities for the online, for the Zoom classes that we were still using Blackboard at that time. We converted to Zoom that fall because it had some increased capacity for us, but it meant a tremendous investment in professional development. And we were fortunate to have support from our foundation to move forward. So a lot of change going on around us, which forces us to examine who we are and how we're working. Our mission still is about access. We are still here for our students. We're not abandoning our completion and student success agenda, but we also recognize that our enrollment better be relevant so the students aren't opting long-term for those $15 to $25 an hour jobs, and they're willing to make the investment, but it's going to mean some different changes for us. So quickly, some changes in front of us. Who are we facing? Our students. Are we sitting in empty classrooms like this guy here on the upper right? How are students learning, and where are they learning? And that group of students looks as though they have a pretty good learning space to participate in. But we saw a tremendous digital divide, recognizing, yes, students have smartphones, but some of the phones are smarter than others. Others are not, quite as smart as they needed to be, or they had the phone and they didn't have all of the access to the internet. So we had to quickly close those gaps. So before the HARE funds came into place, our foundation acted right away and raised resources to make sure that laptops were available and that there would be ways for students to tap into to connect with us. And we are aware that there were students who were using public spaces like McDonald's and parking lots and a friend's computer and competition in a household with K through 12 siblings and parents who were remote working. It was not a good scene. And we were able to see into many of those lives by simply looking at screens, and insisting that they turn their camera on was sometimes very invasive. And we had to have some flexibility in that regard as well, not only for students, but for some of our adjunct faculty members. We were able to see that there were some gaps in terms of what they had happening in their lives. We met a lot of dogs and cats and babies, and that was okay, and spouses and partners, and that was fine. But the reality, according to the clearinghouse, is that 1 million fewer undergrads were enrolled last fall than in the prior 2 years. And that's a big hit for academia, because we know students are not data sets with legs, nor are they dollar signs with legs. Okay, this is their lives, this is their livelihood, and this is the future, not only for them individually, but for those who we serve. And they were gone, they were missing. And so fortunately, a recent Gallup poll indicates that 85% of students who were recently enrolled but stopped out during the pandemic are considering returning. So that's a good indicator. However, 41% of associate degree candidates are considering stopping out. So we have to be mindful of what's happening, and do we have the right sort of messaging? Is it the same mix? Are we saying come back and things are the way they've been? Because we know their lives are very, very difficult. So we still have to work on issues like belonging, but we have to address very seriously mental health concerns. I heard on the news since I've been here how difficult it is to get appointments for mental health care. We were fortunate to be able to build a Department of Mental Health and Counseling, a beautiful space that looks like a professional office with donor grants to create that center. And I use the term PTSD there, and I am a layperson, and I apologize to we're not trying to appropriate that diagnosis for those who are have served in the military, and we're very grateful for that service. But it is part of the dialogue that we're having in leadership to recognize that people are experiencing anxiety. There are certain things that can create great sense of anxiety for them, or loss or sadness. And we need to be sensitive to these dynamics in the workplace for our students, as well as, again, for our employees and ourselves, even as the leaders. We're walking around, we don't get special leadership jackets to wear. So we're facing many of the same concerns, and many times going home to many of these concerns, and we put on our good face, and we do the work that we have to do. But we do need to be mindful of these issues and find holistic ways of addressing them. Many student parents who schools were opening, then they were closing, then they were opening, they were closing. So how were they able to manage that? And we know that there are some disparities based on those who've been historically underrepresented, who are working harder as they are facing disparities in some of the services in the community to manage the experience of being in school. And there are refugees who are seeking refuge and coming to our country. So we'll need to have our doors open for these populations as well. So a confluence of concerns that we need to be mindful of as we're thinking about, let's just open the doors and enroll. And, gee, there's this pandemic, now we have online. Surely everyone will flock to the community college because we have the price advantage on tuition. That's not what happened. We're not really branded as as higher ed's place for online learning. So we need to think about that. I know we may not want to stay forever branded as the 100% place. We like seeing each other in person, and there's good value to that as we look at our spaces, our learning spaces, but we'll need to figure out how we get folks back and what is the messaging that will let them know that they're welcome and supportive. And there are a lot of things that we do well online. So how will we have a both and situation? So change is around us, it's within us, change is in front of us as we look at our students, and change is certainly ahead of us. And so we have adapted very well in many instances with pivoting and getting that curriculum changed so we can offer it in online formats. I do envision that we'll be looking at streamlined curriculums. Do many of you have micro-credentials already on your campuses? Okay, our Faculty Senate just passed a resolution to begin the development of micro-credentials, because we must think about shared governance within our all this change and swirl. Don't forget that this is academia still. And it's a part of the transparency to have very frank conversations with our colleagues as change is happening. And we have to help prepare our students to have this ongoing ability to adapt. And that may need to be baked into our curriculum as we're examining gen ed issues. And new credentialing models are coming up, the micro-credentials. I've added the UN Sustainable Development Goals as something to think about as well. And these lists are by no means exhaustive. They're just something to help us to just think about the categories more so. So there's much more involved with curriculum. I do want to say that as we look 10 years into the future, I'm seeing a lot more blurred lines between sectors. more sector overlap. I'm hearing more four-year institutions, including highly selective colleges, talk about workforce. That was a word they never used, workforce, that's our word. And affordability. Wow, okay, that sounds like community colleges. I glanced over some of the details of a new proposal from MIT. You may have seen that in some of the headlines, looking at what they're calling new educational institutions, NEIs. What a clever term, new educational institutions. I think we could have been a little more clever, but that's okay. But it's based on 6 items here. One is that they move from becoming focused on research to teaching. Who does that sound like? Us, okay? That they have flipped classrooms. Wow, okay, flipped classrooms. That they have interdisciplinary learning. Okay, well, that's, that belongs to all of us. Stackable micro-credentials. There it is, okay? This is sort of what we would think about as our territory. Co-op internships and experiential learning, and that extracurricular activities on campus help to promote wellness. And so I'm not a cynic. I feel as though we are all in it together as higher ed institutions, collaborating collectively against lack of education so that we can address the needs. So I don't want us to have a lot of bickering and infighting, but I think we'll need to really put our heads together to see what is new and next that's really different and leverage this moment. And so I see, again, this overlap. And I read a line that said we are all immigrants in this new metaverse of technology and education. And so, territory is something, you mentioned the land use agreement statement. And so this is something where I feel possessive, like, gee, that's our territory, but we've got to do this collectively and not feel that as though there are those boundaries. Inclusive access is part of our vocabulary now as we think about access not only to the tech, but also to the learning materials, the OERs, and so forth. Our instruction modes are shifting. The AAC&U, American Association of Colleges and Universities, you can find information about high impact practices like project-based learning and team learning, problem-based learning. The internships are there. And this is going to be an important way for us to engage our students with the content and also engage business partners who can be connected in relevant ways. So everybody leaves with a resume that can help them as they're going into the job market. One of the interesting things about that MIT proposal is that they want to have that experiential learning earlier in the curriculum. So if a student doesn't finish their degree, they have a credential for the workforce. And so I think there's a lot that we can learn from each other. And some of these are bold objectives. There were a couple of institutions that do that well already. And so to make that more pervasive and ubiquitous across all systems is significant. The Gallup poll that I mentioned referenced a reason why students stay in school. And the 2 highest reasons were financial aid that's available to them. And the second is the perceived value of their degree in the marketplace. And so it's a good time for us to really focus on career education. We're already seeing test optional at 4-year institutions. We have at Westchester Community College established a directed self-placement process using multiple measures so that we don't do the high stakes test anymore. It took us a long time to get away from that one. And so we have found tremendous success, and we've even closed some significant equity gaps and put more students into college level guided pathways sooner with holistic supports around them. So a lot of the things that we've learned through the completion and success agenda, we've been making available. Supplemental learning through personalized learning resources and real world applications. Of course, technology is at the base of much of this as it's become ubiquitous across our curriculum. And that's an ongoing effort. We're preparing for the 4th industrial revolution. I mentioned that. And I think the automation is coming. It doesn't feel immediate because you'll see signs, we need more truck drivers, but aren't they going to be automated, individual autonomous vehicles? And yes, so we have this convergence of there's a time factor, but we can't just wait for that to happen. We need to be preparing our students for these matters that lie ahead. And this idea of engaged learning tools is just about technology that can help students to have more of the social interface that they're connected to. Throughout the pandemic, I was so concerned about how are they going to, that look across the room that says, I get your question. Let's have that cup of coffee and talk about that a little bit more. Not happening as much on Zoom. So we've encouraged students to be involved in chats. We did have our online clubs, but I think that the technology is still nascent on how much more engagement can take place related to the learning. And I think it can be rich and affective. I mean, people get married on these apps, don't they? Right? Okay, so that was a little joke there, but it's true. People are able to have strong, deep emotional connections and make big decisions. So I think if they can have those strong connections and develop friendships with the focus on the learning, that could be an important opportunity as well. So we're rounding third now. I know I'm coming from New York, and we won't talk about baseball there so much, but we're rounding third. The student behavior we've talked about, certainly from the emotional perspective, but students are also making different choices. Clearinghouse data is showing that they're moving from school to school as they've moved from state to state. So are we structured to really accept all those different transcripts? Or will we say, gee, you have to have, 12 credits in this distribution in our major in order to get our degree and other stuff like that. Yes, that was my little inside cynic's voice. I came up through the academic leadership pathway. And that's going to be something to, we have to really get serious about credit for prior learning or honoring other learning and making that more seamless for students. We've already talked about balancing education and life. Many students are looking for TikTok style edutainment. We talked about that many years ago. And so we'll have to find the right balance and help them to recognize what deep learning looks like and how best to facilitate that. Maybe by chunking the content. Some schools are sampling with one class at a time, maybe getting in 4 classes in a 15-week semester, but doing them one at a time or other kinds of arrangements. We must give good attention to our DEI efforts and make sure that not only do we have that we have broad awareness of what this is really all about, understanding microaggressions as they exist on our campuses and becoming more culturally responsive institutions. SUNY Westchester Community College, and SUNY is the State University of New York. We are that system has 64 campuses, and these are the colleges, the public colleges and universities outside the New York City, the 5 boroughs, which is CUNY. And some of you are familiar with these the slings, but we're SUNY's first Hispanic serving institution. And we got that designation about a year before I arrived. That's the 25% threshold. And we're now in the mid-40s of percentage of our Latinx population. So we have faculty who have been investing and working with Arizona State University and the National Science Foundation on culturally responsive teaching. And that's really exciting. So within our system, we're seeing the growth of HSIs, and we're becoming a hub for that. So even though we haven't perfected things, we have responsibility to be there at the table so that we can learn together with others. We've seen significant changes in our hiring practices as we've looked at being more inclusive and providing broader access, and have had tremendous success in that regard. Certainly a big area that we're concerned about is institutional sustainability. And that's really the bottom line. I was in retreat with my board just last week and my cabinet, where we addressed many of these issues, and we're having new conversations. And so we have to look at the funding models. We have county support, state support, of course, the tuition amount. Tuition price setting is something we have to be mindful of as it relates to our affordability mission. But the amount of advocacy with the state and local government entities in order to facilitate whatever we end up with is very important, and becomes a big part of our roles in academic, in leadership, in community college leadership. And people don't often think about the fact that we need to sit down with an individual. I remember sitting with a congressional representative many years ago to talk about the higher education emergency relief funds and why they needed to be calculated based on headcount for community colleges and not FTE. That was a big conversation, and having that audience, I needed to be ready to really advocate for that particular nuance. Not a nuance, that's a big deal for us, you know, because half of our students are part-timers. So it takes a whole lot more of them to come up with an FTE. And so having that opportunity and stepping into those leadership roles when we have the opportunity is ever more critical. Workforce funding, we haven't always had financial aid available for students in our workforce programs, our non-degree programs. So in our state, we have a part-time tuition assistance program that our governor announced recently. And part-time Pell has been something that's been on the table as well to help those students. Public-private partnerships. Several years ago, as we were looking at alternative funding streams, my team put together a request for information so we can send out a notification to organizations about investing in spaces on our property that we own, new uses for our real estate holdings that could be mutually beneficial. Well, this is a whole new set of agreements that would be coming forward. And our legal people like, what are you talking about? I said, well, let me explain to you what I'm talking about. You know, shared revenue, lease agreements, and so forth, opportunities for our students to have connections and internships, links to our curriculum, what's appropriate within the appropriate use for our facilities based on state charter. So the role has really changed. The role has really changed. So we have to build teams that can help with the leadership roles. Fierce competition, I mentioned, with our own friends and neighbors. When the selective liberal arts college up the road started a nursing program and an EMT program, like, wow, how did, you know, that's what they did. And so why did they do that? Because they said, hey, Belinda, can I come have coffee with you and let's talk about what you're doing over here? Because you're getting a lot of, you've got a lot of students, you have a lot going on. Little did I know, I was giving away some of the secrets. But again, we're collecting, we're competing collectively against lack of education. My board's like, we want them to come to us. Fundraising has been interesting as we look at free tuition. Our donors are saying, well, do you need our resources for scholarships? And we then have to explain how the price of tuition is different than the cost of education. So we have to be on top of these dynamics that are changing. And even the board relations, when they're saying, you know, how are we going to get through? We have to come up with solutions and have new conversations because everything is on the table. There's no, we've talked about some sort of low-hanging fruit, ways that we can manage costs and generate new revenue, sort of green areas, yellow light, like if we do these, this is going to mean a whole different set of negotiations and conversations. And then there are some red lights areas that if we go there, they're going to be sirens blaring because there are some areas that have been sacrosanct, but it has to be on the table and we have to be able to at least discuss them. So I'm finishing up now so we can have time for a few questions. We know we need to recalibrate, reinvent. In the 10 years coming, I think we'll be doing a lot of healing and repairing, but the spotlight will be heavily on us and we have to be prepared for the kind of accountability that is going to continue. It's shifted from looking at those graduation rates and publishing them, but that doesn't mean we're going to keep that information hidden. We have to face ourselves, face our backgrounds, face the students, and develop our messaging, and be responsible for where we're heading. Access and opportunity remain our core. We must confront the expanding spiral of diversity. We look very closely at census data. We have just advanced a new branch campus in what's now the third largest city in New York State, which is in our county. And so it was really good information, good timing. They're building K through 12 schools there, so we can see the rise in population in our county and the increase of business investment there. We have to be both methodical and intentional, working with empathy and being focused about how we're moving forward. Mass customization is something that will help us. Many of our institutions are large, and so we're using data to help us to put together systems that can help most students in achieving the dream. You're all familiar with achieving the dream, right? Okay, we used to talk about some, more, and most as we were looking at scaling. And so we want to be able to support most students and have the technology do that, but we must be mindful that as we are developing, using data points, there may be people that we're missing. So we still have to have our human eyes and our human hearts on the broader context. Who's missing? How is this working? And who's really not coming back? Well, we got a good response on this outreach through our chat bot or through our CRM, but we are finding that we don't have some groups of individuals who are still outstanding. It could be student parents or Black males, and we're just not. So is that something institutionally? How do we then have a more focused type of outreach? Alternate funding streams I've discussed. People are scrutinizing higher ed. What's the return on investment? Do I take this $20 an hour job and pick up an extra shift, or do I make this longer term investment? Or can I pick up some micro credentials that in a cluster might be a good workforce credential? And we've been touting economic mobility. Do you use those data points now to talk about your institution as an engine of economic mobility? We're very proud of our standings with that. And so it's a good message. And so how do we get that out there for others? And the rise of the deep generalist, which goes back to that interdisciplinary curriculum idea that we heard from MIT. And the notion that individuals who have deep knowledge in more than just a couple of areas. So specialization, you want that for your heart surgeon for sure, right? But, and the person dispensing your meds, but deep generalists may be having specializations in a couple of different areas. And that's part of training students to be adaptable to other, to what might come up next, so that they're not panicked and that they can take the information that they have and use it to solve problems moving forward. So what's ahead in the next 10 years? Big change. And we don't want it to be a big chance. We've seen institutions close. We've seen what seemed like, again, sacrosanct organizations. My son, when he was a teenager, in his first job, I think he was a junior basketball coach at a camp, and he was able to cash his check, and he decided to put it in a shoebox under his bed. And we're like, well, gee, hon, you have this bank account. We've talked about banking. He says, Mom, all the banks on the news are closing. That doesn't look like a good place for me to put money. Why are you guys still putting your money there? It's a great question, right? And so, so things that we thought were really solid, we watched go down. And so I love his financial insight. He's, that way. And so we were able to have that conversation and make it a research project, and it became a family PowerPoint or something like that. Yeah. And so so he gets it. He gets it certainly now in hindsight. But those are important conversations, and we can't leave these things to chance. We have to be willing to make the big change and step into that moment when it occurs. It's a teachable moment, an opportunity to take action. Can't stay in the water if you don't like the seaweed. Too bad. You've got to just, a good thing I'm a strong swimmer, and move through it, all the muck, and get to a place that's more solid from which you can leverage yourself and move up to a higher level, higher ground, solid ground to work on. I just love this image of the student with the virtual reality. I think he's doing a tour of New York in the 1800s. That's what I saw. But I think that for us, it's like, what do we see when we look through our virtual reality lens into the future? It together is going to be a future that we create, or it will be created for us. So I challenge each of us to stay alert, stay aware, look around us, look within our institutions, look within ourselves, look at our students, look at where we're going, and make sure that we can do this good work together. So thank you, and we'll open up for questions. And I think there's a microphone available. So.
Thank you so much. I laughed out loud and just appreciated the humor that you infused throughout your presentation and the realness in which you presented your past few years in leadership. So thank you for that. And thank you for modeling that for all of us. I am curious about your advice you would give for those aspiring to be presidents in this not new normal. I know I'm not going to say that. Thank you for that slide. But this next chapter, whatever that is. And then also, I think many of us don't engage as much with trustees on, our college campuses. So thinking about training, air quotes, trustees and making sure that they're familiar with what's ahead of us as well. Any advice there?
There are wonderful organizations available to support trustees. You're probably familiar with the Association of Community College Trustees. They are stellar in the materials that they make available, which you can find online and take a look at, and support your president and your leadership, because it's the president that has the primary relationship with the trustees. I have I've dispersed members of my cabinet across my trustee group, so that there's always a liaison to leadership, but it always has to come back through me or to me, and so that we don't end up having separate little entities around. And I recommend that your institution has trustee orientation, new trustee orientation. The trustee board that hired me in 2015 is different than the trustee board that I'm up with today in 2022. So each one of them I've had to have orientation with. And we also have a New York Community College Trustee Association. So supporting them in their learning, because not doing so can lead to some distances. And what is it? Something that loves a void? I forgot what it is that loves chaos, loves a void maybe. And so if there's too much of a void, there can be confusion, and it's good to stay close to them, because they can be the greatest allies in supporting the goals and objectives. They're there as volunteers. And so we want to give them the agenda, help them to see the information and the data that we're facing, that they can help us with. So that kind of engagement and ongoing training and using those trade organizations is very key. You're welcome. Okay.
Good morning. Great presentation. I'm Mike Carney, Lake Area Tech in South Dakota. So a little bit different perspective, being very rural.
Yes.
But my question would be, what do you see as the impact with what happened with our K-12 systems? The U.S. Secretary of Ed is talking about the missing million because not as many of them went on to college in the past 2 years, and that'll be a permanent ripple. But we're also seeing now studies of maybe the children didn't learn as well during that time period. And I was just wondering if you had any insights or thoughts on that.
I think that the social emotional impact was clearly devastating. Not only did they lose out on the social engagement and the connections to their peer groups, but they saw what was going on in their households. Okay, they know what happened to their parents with employment. They're sharing laptops and so forth. And so it wasn't a good scenario at all. I do think that we'll have to invest in catch up, and that might be a great role for our tech ed providers to help to think about what is needed to really get those students back on track. We saw our enrollment didn't look very good in July, July of 2022, but we have gotten close to closing the gap. We've stopped the bleed is what we did. But it was August, that was the time when parents were bringing those teenagers, and that those new from high school, that number is the one that kind of, I air quotes again, saved our enrollment for the fall. That was the big number, the big jump that came back, because I guess the parents said, you're not staying in the pajamas with the laptop anymore. Let's get here, you'll be close to home. And so I think that, again, there's socio-emotional pieces that we will all have to pay attention to, both in the home, in the community, and on our community college campuses or any other places where they enroll, but also to look at what sorts of ways we can bridge that gap. I mentioned our directed a self-placement process using multiple measures. So we recognize that when students present a high school GPA or an English or math average as part of that information, and originally we were working with an algorithm and that didn't quite work out well. So we do have a survey that they're able to take, and we require certain supports around them. They've done very well, and we've been able to track their performance in subsequent college level courses to make sure that they did have the learning. So I think that that's a great place for technology to step in and close the gap. And we will probably have a period of time where summers and holidays are fun, but also fun with learning, because we'll need to close those gaps, because that could be millions or even billions of dollars of loss in future years if we lose that generation of learners. Mm-hmm.
Thank you for your presentation. My question is around a slide that you shared, Facing the Future. It listed a whole bunch of strategies that we've actually been focused on for many years, even decades. Mm-hmm. And so my question is related to that, and it's twofold. Considering that many of the strategies needed for facing today's and our future realities have been part of the discussions and our focus for many years. First, what strategies do you feel are most critical for us to focus on now? And secondly, which of these areas of focus are most different now compared to pre-pandemic in your perspective?
I thought about that. I said, there's not going to be anything new that I'm introducing to this group, because I've been in higher education for enough decades to know that we're internships, co-ops, these are not novel. I think what's different is our own commitment to execution, because we are now in an era of such accelerated pace of change that we don't have time to admire the problem and have analysis paralysis, those little terms that we've used in our careers previously. I looked at the first Zoom meeting I had with my strategic administrative leadership team, strategic action leadership team, SALT is the name of it. And I said, bring your coffee mugs and we'll be on the Zoom screens together. And I tried to make it, gee, we're all in this together, but I saw their faces and it really tore me apart. They were just like, what are we going to do? Where are we? So I think starting where you are with your team, we have to invest in people, because you can't do this work alone. We quickly began to decentralize our leadership structures, and we adopted an agile model for how we worked. And we used our existing strategic planning structure, which has cross-functional teams, to empower co-chairs of faculty and administrators and staff, 3 chairs for each of the strategic planning areas, and bringing those ideas together. So we kind of democratized the leadership by spreading it out, because I couldn't control people in their homes and on these Zoom boxes. So a different model for the way we work together, cross-functional dependencies on information sharing in order to come up with scenarios and solutions. And that was very empowering and engaged a lot of people across a lot of units, because again, I couldn't manage, no management by walking around during a pandemic on Zoom. And so We did that. We learned about the principles of agile organizations and we studied that together. We adopted the four disciplines of execution book, the Covey book, and we looked at what were our most wildly important goals. We called them wildly important and necessary goals, WINGs. We looked at lead measures versus lag measures, and the lead measures, instead of waiting to see how many students we retained and how many graduated, we focused on what the actions were that we needed to take on a daily and weekly basis, and then had a weekly cadence of accountability where we looked at our scorecard. So changing within. And I would say that some of the change is very hard because we do have our shared governance model. And so working with our faculty to be transparent about the data and the outcomes and the goals and having those new conversations, some of which were very difficult, and meeting people where they are to explain the language and talk about this landscape, because it's very different when we're working at systems level than people working at a department or classroom level. So it's a journey. It's an exploration, it's an adventure, and we're in it together. Reach out across your institutions to share with each other. Check in with me. There's my social media stuff. So I will let me know that you were here at Witchy, and maybe we'll get to have more conversations. It's been such a delightful pleasure to be with you here this morning. I thank you once again.
Thank you very much, Dr. Miles. It was a pleasure. I very much appreciated the phrase duty to act.